that reminds me of some a big takeaway from Design for How People Learn about learning objectives.
Yeah.
So when you talk about it, it's from your chapter on what's the goal. You have this phrase that really resonated with me, that jargon, that instructional design jargon, can serve a purpose for the design team in making sure the learning objectives are precise, but it's just cruel to bludgeon your learners with it. Can you talk
Yeah.
more about that? And has that generated any reactions among teaching and learning people who I'll readily admit I've been in courses where we've had our Bloomic language of our learning objectives, and we're going to analyze, and we're going to do this
Yeah.
and that. Could you talk about that?
Well, if you think about learning objectives, and Will Thalheimer is really the person to talk to about this because he's done a bunch of deep dives into what the research literature say about like using learning objectives,
Yeah.
and communicating them to users. The main things that we're trying to do with learning objectives is to kind of give ourselves a good sort of design North Star that we're working towards when we're designing the curriculum, right? And so that's that very precise, Bloom's taxonomy. We've got our language defined. We've got this whole thing, laid out. We've got a specific format. We're trying to indicate the conditions or potentially the standard to which, we're going to evaluate or, all those things. And so that's all great for learning designers because they've been taught that jargon and they've been taught to speak that language and
Yeah.
understand what that all means. And, you can tell when you see, learning designers who like, kind of, head thwack over the understand learning objectives and, things like that. Um, uh, because that's supposed to be kind of our again our compass for design, we do want those to be precise, and we do have a jargon that, or kind of set of a vocabulary that we use around it. That's great. But when we think about what the purposes are of kind of putting those out to our learners, well, it could be helping the learner understand what they need to focus on in the course. That's one of the uses for learning objectives that's kind of substantiated in the research literature. If you put these learning objectives up front and make sure people, kind of process them a little bit, then they will pay more attention to the points in the course that are related to the learning objectives and
Yeah.
potentially retain a little bit more. Now, it has a double effect, right? Like it can increase that, but it can actually also decrease the attention that they pay to content that isn't related to the learning objectives. And the other thing it can do is it can help them know what standard of performance they're going to be held to at the end of it. Like what do I need to be able to do at the end of it that and we can look at things like what's their level of confidence about those, or we can do some kind of assessment where they have to do some sort of performance activity and we figure out, can they do the thing that we said that they were going to be able to do? And so if you're saying as a designer, okay, I need to let learners know what they need to focus on, and I need to let learners know what standard they're going to be held to, you can ask the question of what would be the best way to communicate that to the learners. And it's usually not, here's a bullet list of learning objectives at the beginning of the course, you know, because we're sort of teaching people to ignore all the boilerplate stuff that happens at the beginning of the course and they just want to get into it.
Hmm.
So if it is genuinely important to me to communicate those things to the learners, then I need to think about what's the format or the modality or the whatever that's going to do this. And I was sort of feeling this. I was having a conversation last week with somebody about student-centered syllabi, right? Because I was looking at a
Oh,
syllabus.
yeah, yeah.
I'm an advisory panel, and I was looking at the syllabus, and like, I mean, it's a perennial complaint, right? That students don't read the syllabus. We talk about this all the time.
Hmm.
I had students who didn't, when I was teaching undergraduates, I had students who didn't read the syllabus either. And, like there's jokes about it. And there's the guy who like, I think he had something in the syllabus where he was like, hey, there's $100 in this locker and you can just go
Oh,
get it.
yeah.
And
Yes.
like nobody did, so it's like proof that nobody was reading the syllabus. But I look at some of these syllabi and I'm like, I wouldn't want to read this either. This is full of boilerplate, and the stuff I care about is very dense. And, like I need 4 pieces of information from this really to function as a student. And they're all buried on page 7 and 19 of this incredibly long syllabus. And so, like, if we were really saying, I need to design this document to work as well as possible for students to do X, Y, and Z, is this syllabus the document that I would produce? Probably not, and then why are we doing it? Well, it's tradition, and there's
Yeah.
legalese and, whatever. And like, that's fine. Like, I get it. Some of that stuff has to happen. But just asking the question of, are we only doing this because it's traditional? Or are we doing this because it's effective based on the underlying goals for what it is we're trying to accomplish? Um, and if what I'm trying to accomplish is to really orient the students to the class and the purpose of it, and give them a real sense of what they're going to experience throughout the course of the semester and what it's going to look like, would I ever do it this way? Or if I'm going to try to let students know what the highlights they should focus on, or what their standard they're going to be held to, would I use learning objectives to do it? So I think it's just about like making sure you're asking what the purpose of these things are, and then is this designed well given my circumstances and my audience and my situation and my resources and all of those kinds of things.
Yeah, yeah. I'm reminded you touch on some alternatives for anyone who hasn't yet read Design for How People Learn, we'll have links in the video description. Could you share maybe an example of something you've encountered where it kind of gets the point across of a learning objective, but isn't as such jargony, dry, bullet point?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always a fan of like problem-based or case-based things, right?
Yeah.
And so, here you're going to do a course for managers on responding to sexual harassment, like preventing and responding to sexual harassment complaints or something like that. Well, you start with a scenario and they say, okay, do you know how to do this, this, and this with this employee sitting across their desk
Yeah.
from you crying, telling you about this? Do you know how to do all of these things? Maybe you don't. Guess what? We're going to work on that in this course. But by the end of it, you need to be able to, respond, correctly legally, and also in a way that's empathetic to this employee, and also, in a way that you're protecting them and ensuring that the best possible outcome happens, things like that. And you can communicate all of this stuff about what you need to do, but in a way that like has some emotional resonance for them.
Yeah. Just making it real, not just like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, it's 10 bullet points. We'll
Right.
see if I absorb that or not.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, no, I remember actually it was from some of the language learning curriculum, and it was to assess students' levels of where they were with the language. And it was a really great piece because it wasn't like multiple choice questions. I mean, it kind of was in the end, but it was three frames, and it was like cat in whatever the target language was. Cat, this is a cat. The cat is sitting next to the telephone on top of the desk, whatever. And it was just like, which of these are you comfortable reading? And so just being able to recognize it in a way that
Yeah.
feels real, I think there's something similar that, we can kind of think about with either it's communicating learning objectives, or it's setting people up, or it's, the crucial information that's in a syllabus, whatever these things are. How do I, how do I talk to people about it in a way that it feels tangible and, um, real to them? Because you mentioned when we were setting up, you were mentioning that you read my more recent book, which is Talk to the Elephant. And one of the big things that I look at there is this sort of disconnect between like kind of intellectual knowledge versus sort of visceral
Yeah.
feeling, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of behavior change problems occur when our intellectual knowledge is different than what our kind of visceral experience of the world is. So, like, for example, my hand looks pretty clean right now. My intellectual knowledge is, it's not that clean because I've been touching stuff around the office and whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if I was going to prepare food or, do a medical procedure or something, that there's germs on my hand, but it looks okay, right?
Mhm.
And so like hand washing as a thing has issues because even though we intellectually know that there's germs and we need to kind of keep it clean and things like that, when you're in the thick of preparing food or, doing something like that, it's easy to kind of forget that because they look okay, looks fine, right? So my
Yeah.
visual experience is telling me one thing and my intellectual knowledge is telling me something else. And when those things kind of contradict each other, we tend to find that it's the crux of those that has a lot of behavior change issues. So intellectually, I know that if I am not really like on top of my sunscreen, that I may
Mhm.
have problems down the road,
Yeah.
but they're
Yep.
future problems for future me. Um, And my current self is like, well, as long as I don't actually get painful sunburn, yeah, you know. And I mean, I try to stay on top of that stuff, but it's still easy for that to those kinds of things to erode. And whenever we're only talking to that intellectual knowledge and we're not incorporating anything in terms of visual experience, it's just harder to like allocate our attention to that. It's harder to pay attention. It's harder to, you know, it's more effortful, you know, all of those
Mhm.
kinds of things. And so why not figure out? I mean, we all have limited resources. We all have to pick and choose
Yep,
where we
yep,
spend those resources,
yep.
but if we can, why not make it easier for students to engage with that material if possible?
Join us for part 3, elephants, riders, and stick figures.